The park stood quietly at the edge of the city, a small, often overlooked place. Its grass wasn't the greenest, and the benches bore the marks of time, scratches, initials, forgotten gum hardened like old memories. But it had a swing. Just one. Wooden seat, iron chains, creaking every time the wind passed through. Every afternoon around 4, the same little girl came. She didn't run or laugh like most children. Instead, she walked. Slowly. Head slightly bowed, hands gripping the straps of her backpack. Her name was Amelia. She would sit on the swing in silence, letting it move just a little. Forward, then back. Back, then forward. She never spoke. Not to other children. Not to parents nearby. Not to the man with the hot dog cart who once offered her a free bun with extra mustard. She simply sat, swinging gently, eyes often staring at something far away, something that didn't exist in the park. Across from the swing, under a large sycamore tree, sat an elderly woman. Always the same seat. Always around 4. Her name was Margaret. Hair as white as chalk, skin like paper folded 100 times. She wore a gray coat and held a small thermos of tea, though she rarely drank it. Instead, she watched. She watched Amelia. Margaret didn't say anything either. Not at first. She just observed the girl, the way one might watch a familiar bird return to its nest. There was no judgment in her gaze, only recognition. Day after day, the same rhythm played out. Amelia came. Saturday. Swung. Margaret watched. Sipped tea. Time passed. Leaves turned. The sun grew sleepy earlier. Coats thickened. And then one day, it rained. It wasn't a loud, thunderous kind of rain. Just a steady, persistent drizzle that turned the dirt to mud and made the swing creak in a lower, sadder tone. Most people avoided the park that day. But not Amelia. She arrived wearing a yellow raincoat, slightly too big, sleeves rolled up. In one hand, she carried an umbrella. In the other, her usual silence. Margaret was there too, though the bench was slick with water. She sat anyway, a towel beneath her. The thermos steamed in her hands. Amelia walked past the swing for the first time. Stood before Margaret. Didn't speak. Then, quietly, she opened the umbrella and held it above the old woman. Margaret looked up, surprised. Her eyes, long dry, glistened. For a long moment, they just stood like that. A girl and an old woman beneath a shared umbrella in a nearly empty park. Then Margaret smiled. "You're late," she said. It was the first word either had spoken. Amelia blinked. Then smiled back. Just a little. That was the day everything changed. The park was quieter than usual that Monday afternoon. The breeze rustled through the trees, stirring up memories only the leaves remembered. Margaret sat on her bench, her hands resting in her lap, a well-worn book unopened beside her. Her gaze, distant but her lap, a well-worn book unopened beside her. Her gaze, distant but sharp, followed the little girl as she made her way across the park once more. Amelia. She came every day around the same time, in a faded yellow dress and worn-out sneakers that scuffed against the gravel path. Her hair was tied in 2 low pigtails, though they always seemed to be coming undone by the time she reached the swing set. She never brought toys. Never brought friends. Just herself, and something unspoken that she carried like a shadow. Margaret had watched her for weeks now. From her usual seat on the weathered wooden bench, just a few yards from the swing, she had grown used to Amelia's silent presence. The girl would sit on the swing but rarely swing. She would kick the ground gently, sometimes looking up at the clouds, sometimes staring at the empty swing beside her. It wasn't the kind of sadness that cried out loud. It was the quiet kind. The kind that lingers in silence, hoping someone will notice but not quite knowing how to ask. Margaret knew that kind. Her own silence had once stretched for months after losing her daughter. She remembered the day her world had changed. It had been a day like any other. Her daughter, Lily, had left for college, promising to call that night. But the call never came. An accident. A moment. And suddenly, Margaret's world had shrunk to the confines of a too-quiet house and the hollow echo of an unused room. For a long time, she didn't leave the house. Then, one morning, she found herself walking to the park where she had once brought Lily as a child. She sat on a bench and stayed there. Not waiting for anything. Just staying. It became a ritual. The bench, her companion. The trees, her witnesses. Until one day, a little girl in a yellow dress arrived. They hadn't spoken. Not even a nod. But over time, a rhythm emerged. Emilia would come. Margaret would sit. Both would exist beside one another, tethered by a silence that felt oddly comforting. And then came the rain. It had started suddenly, fat droplets tumbling from a sky that had given no warning. Most of the park emptied quickly as parents gathered their children and joggers took shelter. Margaret, caught in her thoughts, hadn't noticed at first. Until she felt something soft above her. She looked up. A small hand held an umbrella over her head. Emilia. The girl didn't speak. Just stood there, arms slightly shaking from the effort of holding the umbrella aloft. Margaret blinked. And for the first time in a long while, she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. Emilia gave a small nod. "You looked cold." Margaret laughed softly, surprised at the sound of her own voice. "I suppose I was." The rain continued, but under the shared canopy, it felt distant. "I'm Margaret," she said after a moment. "Emilia." They stood like that for a while, no rush to go anywhere, no urgency to fill the silence. Just the soft patter of rain around them and the gentle hum of connection forming in the spaces between their words. The next day, Emilia arrived with 2 paper cups of hot cocoa. They were giving them out at the church, she explained shyly, handing one to Margaret. Margaret took it, her fingers brushing Emilia's. "You're very kind." Emilia shrugged. "You looked like you needed something warm." That day, they talked. Not about big things. Just enough. Emilia mentioned that she lived nearby with her aunt. That school was boring. That she liked drawing, though she didn't show anyone her sketches. Margaret talked about the flowers in the park. How some of them only bloomed in late summer. How the big maple tree near the swings had a name. "You named it?" Emilia asked. Margaret nodded. "Hope." "Why?" Margaret looked at the tree, its branches heavy with green. "Because it kept growing, even after everything." Emilia didn't say anything, but her eyes softened. That night, Margaret wrote in her journal for the first time in months. Over the next few weeks, the bench and the swing were no longer just wood and metal. They were gathering places for words, for glances, for healing. Emilia brought her sketchpad and began drawing under the shade of hope. Margaret would read aloud sometimes, poetry, mostly, or old letters she had written but never sent. They shared memories like pebbles tossed into a quiet pond, letting the ripples do their work. One afternoon, Emilia handed Margaret a drawing. It was of the bench, the swing, and 2 small figures sitting side by side. Margaret looked at it, her throat tight. "It's beautiful. I think, maybe it's what we look like," Emilia said. "To the tree." Margaret laughed, and for the first time in years, it wasn't tinged with sadness. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it tiptoes in with small kindnesses, shared silences, and the gift of being seen. And so, the woman on the bench and the girl on the swing began a new story. Not one of endings, but one of beginnings. The next day, the rain had passed, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the sky. Emilia arrived a little earlier than usual, her boots squishing softly against the damp path. This time, instead of heading to the swing, she walked directly to the bench. Margaret was already there, a book in her lap, closed. She looked up as Emilia approached. "No rain today," she said. Emilia nodded. "But I brought the umbrella anyway." Margaret chuckled, a low, warm sound that felt like it hadn't been used in years. She patted the space beside her. Amelia hesitated, then sat. They sat in silence for a while. Not awkward silence, but something gentler. The kind that allows breathing. "You come every day," Margaret finally said. Amelia nodded again. "It's quiet here. And you like the swing?" "I used to," Amelia replied. "Before." Margaret didn't press. She knew the weight of before. "I had a daughter," Margaret said instead. She liked the swings too, especially when she was your age. Amelia turned slightly. "What happened to her?" "She grew up. Moved away." Then, Margaret paused, eyes tracing the branches above them. "She didn't come back." A small gust of wind danced between them, carrying away unspoken things. "I'm sorry," Amelia said, her voice barely audible. Margaret smiled faintly. "Thank you." Another moment passed. Then Amelia reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notepad. "I write sometimes. Stories." Margaret leaned closer, her curiosity gentle. "About what?" "People. Parks. Swings." Margaret nodded. "You should read me one someday." "Maybe." They stayed like that until the light began to fade. When Amelia stood to leave, she looked back at the bench. Margaret was watching the sky. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Amelia asked. Margaret didn't turn. "I always am." From that day on, the swing remained empty more often. The bench between them had become something else entirely, a bridge. The girl and the old woman, once two islands, had begun to build something between them. Something made of silence, of memory, and the smallest kind of hope. And every day after, the park no longer seemed quite so lonely. The crisp air of mid-autumn wrapped the park in amber and gold. The swing no longer creaked as often, and the leaves crunched gently beneath small and slow feet. Amelia and Margaret now sat together daily, as if they'd done so all their lives. Their bench had become a rhythm in both their days. One Thursday afternoon, Amelia arrived with a folded piece of paper instead of her notebook. Margaret noticed a change. "What's that?" she asked, taking a slow sip of tea. Amelia hesitated. "It's a story. I wrote it last night. But I don't want to read it out loud." Margaret nodded. "Then may I read it?" She held out her hand. Amelia gave her the folded paper. Margaret opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, with some words crossed out, rewritten in the margins. She read silently as Amelia watched the path ahead. It was a story about a swing in an empty park, and a girl who sat on it because the world didn't understand her silence. Then came an old tree, and a woman who sat beneath it, waiting for someone to see her again. The girl and the woman never spoke, but the swing started to move differently when they were near. Margaret finished the story. She folded the paper slowly. "That's beautiful," she said. Amelia bit her lip. "Is it sad?" "Yes," Margaret replied. "But it's the kind of sad that makes you feel less alone. That's the best kind." They didn't say anything else that day, but Amelia's smile lingered longer. A week later, it was Margaret who brought something. "Close your eyes," she said when Amelia sat down. Amelia, though puzzled, did so. Margaret placed something small and round in her palm. "Okay. Open." It was a compass. Old, brass, and still ticking. "It belonged to my husband," Margaret said. "He was a traveler. When he passed, I kept this. Thought it would help me feel like I still had some direction. But I think you should have it now." Amelia looked down at the compass, then up at Margaret. "Why me?" "Because your stories will take you places. And you'll need to know how to find your way back." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes. Not the heavy kind. The grateful kind. And so their bond deepened. No longer just silence and shared umbrellas. Now stories, artifacts, and truths passed between them. Each day brought something new. A poem read aloud. A pressed leaf tucked into a notebook. Margaret even let Amelia help knit a scarf. Though her stitches were uneven, they were warm. They didn't talk about what brought them to the park. Not anymore. That sorrow had softened, like fabric worn to comfort. But every so often, when the wind stirred the trees and the swing creaked faintly, they'd both look at it. And remember. Not with pain, but with quiet reverence. Because sometimes, healing didn't come in thunderclaps or grand gestures. Sometimes, it came in the form of a quiet swing and a bench beside it. Winter approached with gentle footsteps. The trees shed their last leaves like whispered farewells, and the ground stiffened under the touch of frost. The swing now hung motionless more often, coated with a delicate sheen of ice, but the bench, Margaret and Amelia's bench, remained occupied. Amelia came bundled in layers, her red scarf fluttering behind her like a flag of childhood resilience. Margaret brought an extra blanket, which she always offered without words. Amelia would smile and wrap it around her legs, grateful beyond expression. One afternoon, snowflakes began to fall, soft, slow, almost uncertain of their place in the world. Amelia reached out a mittened hand to catch one. "Do you think snow remembers where it's been?" she asked. Margaret paused before replying. "I think snow forgets on purpose, so it can land somewhere new." Amelia nodded, thoughtful. "I think I used to forget a lot. On purpose." Margaret looked at her, eyes full of knowing. Some things we're not ready to remember. That day, Amelia opened her notepad again. But this time, she didn't write a story. Instead, she drew lines and shapes. A bench. A swing. A tall tree. A small figure with a scarf. And an older woman, her face marked with the gentle creases of time. She handed it to Margaret. "Is this us?" Margaret asked, smiling. "Yes," Amelia said. "It's how I see us." Margaret ran a hand gently over the drawing. "Then it's perfect." The days shortened, and Margaret began bringing small thermoses of soup. They would eat together, spooning warm broth into cold mouths, and between bites, share pieces of memory. "I used to be a teacher," Margaret told her one afternoon. "What did you teach?" "Stories. Words. Literature." Amelia's eyes lit up. "No wonder you understand mine." Margaret chuckled. "Perhaps that's why I saw you. Long before you saw me." Amelia stared ahead. "I saw you. I just didn't know if I was allowed to." Margaret tilted her head. "Allowed? I thought maybe grown-ups didn't want to be seen anymore. Like they were too full of broken pieces." Margaret was quiet for a while. "Sometimes we are. But being seen doesn't make us shatter, it helps us hold together." That night, Amelia wrote a story called The Woman of Winter Words. It was about an old tree that whispered wisdom only when the snow fell. Children passed it by for years, not knowing its magic. Until one girl listened, and the tree finally spoke. By late January, Margaret's steps grew slower. Amelia noticed, though she never said anything. Instead, she adjusted her own pace to match. One particularly cold day, Margaret didn't show up. Amelia sat alone for the first time in months. She brought both blankets. She poured tea into 2 cups, even though one stayed full. The park felt larger. The bench, wider. The swing creaked, moved by the wind alone. When she returned the next day, Margaret was there. Pale, tired, but smiling. "Had a small cold," she said. "Old bones and winter don't always get along." Amelia didn't reply. She simply took Margaret's hand and held it in hers. From that day, Amelia brought soup. The trust between them grew thick like the snowbanks lining the path. They began to speak not just of memories, but of fears, hopes, and the fragile things in between. "I dreamt of her last night," Margaret whispered once. "Your daughter?" "Yes. She was on the swing, laughing. Amelia looked down. I dream of my brothers sometimes. We used to come here together. What happened? There was an accident. A lake. He fell through the ice. Margaret didn't speak. She simply reached out and held her hand again. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. As February waned, so did the harshest bite of winter. The first buds appeared on stubborn trees. The swing began to sway a little more. One day, Amelia arrived with her arms full of something bundled in cloth. She set it down beside the bench and began to unwrap it. It was a birdhouse. I made it, she said, proudly. In class. For someone who makes me feel safe. Margaret's eyes filled. It's beautiful. Where should we put it? They chose the old sycamore. Margaret watched as Amelia climbed carefully, with the help of a small stool and determination. When it was hung, they sat together, watching the wind test its balance. Now the birds will know where to go, Amelia said. Margaret nodded. And maybe, someday, someone else will sit here and see it. And wonder about the girl who gave shelter. That night, Margaret began a journal. The first entry read, Today, a little girl gave me a birdhouse. And I realized, it's never too late to be someone's home. By the time March arrived, the snow had melted completely. The swing moved more freely, and children began to return to the park. But the bench remained theirs, quiet, sacred, unchanged. One Saturday, Amelia brought a letter. I wrote something, she said. For school. But it's about us. Margaret adjusted her glasses and read it aloud. Some friendships are born in the middle of life in silence. Some are found not in classrooms, but in parks. Not in loud laughter, but in quiet swings. My friend is older than anyone I've ever known. But she listens. And when she listens, I feel seen. Like the broken parts of me are pieces of something important. Margaret's voice broke toward the end. She took off her glasses, wiped her eyes, and hugged Amelia close. You're going to change the world with your words, she whispered. Amelia smiled. You already changed mine. And so winter ended, not with a thaw, but with warmth that came from something deeper than spring. A friendship had bloomed. Rooted in silence, watered by shared pain, and now reaching toward the light. Together, they had built something stronger than sorrow. A story. A sanctuary. And each day, as the swing creaked nearby, it sang a new kind of song, one of hope, of healing, and of a bond that defied age or loss. Just a girl. Just an old woman. But to each other, they were everything. Spring did not arrive all at once, it crept in, shy and hesitant, with tiny buds and soft winds. The trees stretched their limbs and yawned after their long slumber, and the grass returned in patches like hesitant laughter after tears. The park came alive again. Children darted through its winding paths, kites took to the skies, and laughter echoed once more. Yet, through the renewed hum of life, the bench and the swing remained sacred, almost untouched by time. Amelia's red scarf had been replaced by a light blue cardigan. Margaret had traded her heavy wool coat for a thinner one, and though her movements were slower, her eyes sparkled with the same fierce clarity. One morning, Amelia arrived with a jar of wildflowers. For the bench, she said. Margaret smiled. Now it looks like someone loves it. I think it always knew, Amelia said, setting the jar between them. It was just waiting for someone to say so. They began a new routine. Margaret brought poetry books. Amelia brought her own notebook. Some days they read, some days they wrote. Some days, they just listened to the wind and the rustling of leaves like pages turning in a giant invisible book. Margaret introduced Amelia to her favorite poems, Dickinson, Frost, Angelou. Amelia read them with a kind of reverence usually reserved for whispered secrets. One day, after finishing a poem titled The Road Not Taken, Amelia looked up. Do you think choosing the harder road always makes the better story? Margaret tilted her head. Not always, but it makes the truer one. Emilia scribbled in her notebook. Then I want to be true. Not perfect. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard, Margaret said softly. The swing had become a symbol now, not just of loss or memory, but of connection. Other children noticed. Some asked to sit on it. Emilia always nodded. It's for everyone, she'd say. But it remembers. One afternoon, a small boy about 6 climbed onto the swing. He was quiet, unsure. Margaret and Emilia watched from the bench. As he began to sway gently, his mother sat nearby, watching him with a guarded kind of hope. Later, when they left, the mother walked over to the bench. I hope it's okay, she said. He hasn't played in months. We lost his sister. Margaret placed a gentle hand over hers. Of course it's okay. That swing has held a lot of sorrow. But it's good at turning it into something else. The woman's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She nodded and walked away. Afterward, Emilia turned to Margaret. It's like the swing listens. Maybe it does, Margaret said. Maybe all it ever needed was someone to believe that it could. In late April, Emilia had a school assignment to interview someone who had changed her life. I chose you, she told Margaret. Margaret laughed gently. Then I hope I'm a good subject. They met early that Saturday. Emilia carried a recorder and a list of questions. But as the conversation unfolded, it moved beyond structure. What's the bravest thing you've ever done? Emilia asked. Let myself be seen again, Margaret answered. When did you know we were friends? The day you held the umbrella over me. Do you still miss her? Every single day. What would you tell her if you could? That I kept loving. Even when it hurt. And that I found someone who reminded me why. Emilia sat still for a long moment. Then, gently, she reached across and took Margaret's hand. I think she knows. The interview became more than an assignment, it became a record of their bond. Emilia submitted it with trembling hands. Her teacher returned it 2 days later with only one note scribbled at the top. This isn't just an interview. It's a love letter to humanity. Never stop writing. Margaret framed a copy of the essay and placed it on her mantle. My first publication, she joked. One afternoon in May, Emilia arrived late. Her face was tight with worry. I'm sorry, she said, out of breath. My dad, he got a job offer. In another city. Margaret's heart paused. Far away? 4 hours. We have to move. They sat in silence. I don't want to go, Emilia whispered. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. It's okay to not want things. It's also okay to grow. What if I forget this? Us? You won't, Margaret said. Because the parts of us that matter live in who you become. Emilia buried her face in Margaret's coat. I'm scared. I am too, Margaret admitted. Over the next few weeks, they made a plan. They created a shared journal, passing it back and forth, filling it with letters, drawings, quotes, and stories. Emilia wrote about her fears, Margaret responded with encouragement and wisdom. They agreed to keep mailing it, no matter the distance. They also planted a small tree beside the bench. A maple. Emilia named it Hope. It'll grow even after we go, she said. Like love does, Margaret replied. The day before Emilia's move, they sat on the bench longer than usual. No words. Just quiet. Finally, Emilia stood. This place, this bench, will always be part of me. Margaret nodded. And you'll always be part of it. They hugged, not as a farewell, but as a promise. As Emilia walked away, she turned back and waved. Margaret waved in return, her hand trembling, her eyes wet. And when she was alone again, she sat quietly, listening to the swing creak. But this time, it didn't sound lonely. It sounded like memory. Like legacy. Like love. and as spring reached its full bloom, the old bench held one story close and waited patiently for another to begin. Summer painted the sky with a deeper blue, and the days stretched longer like generous arms reaching out to embrace all that had grown. The park shimmered in warmth, buzzing with life, but to Margaret, it felt quieter without Amelia. The bench and swing remained, companions in waiting. The maple tree, Hope, had grown a few new leaves, bright and tender. Margaret visited daily, carrying a book in one hand and the memory of a child in the other. But even in absence, Amelia was present. Each week, without fail, the journal arrived. June 3rd, Amelia's entry. Dear Margaret, the new city smells different. It's louder, faster. There's a park here, but the swings are made of plastic and don't creak. I sit on them sometimes, but they don't feel like ours. School is strange. I miss the way you explain poems to me, not just with words, but with silence. My teacher asked me to write a story. I started one about a bench and a girl. It's just the beginning, but it already feels like home. Love. Amelia. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she turned the page. She took her pen and wrote. June 6th, Margaret's entry. My dear Amelia. Plastic swings may not creak, but your heart still does, beautifully, truthfully. I'm proud of you for writing. Keep beginning. Keep wandering. The best stories find their own endings. Hope has 4 new leaves. I think she misses you too. Always. Margaret. The journal became their bridge. Pages were filled with observations, musings, sketches of the sky, and memories of their favorite poems. Sometimes Amelia sent dried flowers or a pressed leaf. Sometimes Margaret tucked in a photograph or a feather she'd found on her walks. Their words crossed miles like whispers in the wind. In July, a letter arrived, not part of the journal, but sealed in a lavender envelope. Margaret, you always said true things deserve to be said aloud. So here's one. You saved me. I was small and scared when we met. I didn't know what I was looking for. But you were there. And you didn't try to fix me, you just sat with me, like the bench, like the swing, like the wind. If I ever write a book, the first page will say, For Margaret, who sat beside me. Love always. Amelia. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest. Her eyes, so used to tears, welcomed them again like old friends. That week, she brought a box to the park, filled with copies of the journal entries she'd kept, the lavender envelope, and photographs. She placed it beneath Hope's roots. For memory, she whispered. One morning in late July, Margaret noticed a young woman sitting at the far end of the bench. She was sketching the swing, quiet and intent. They exchanged a nod. After a while, the young woman asked, Did you know the girl who used to swing there? Margaret smiled. I did. She's a writer now. The girl nodded. My sister read me a story she wrote. It was about a girl, an old woman, and a swing. She said it was real. Margaret's breath caught. It was. August brought heat waves and cicadas. Margaret grew slower, but her heart beat steady with purpose. She began writing again, long letters to Amelia, reflections for herself, poetry that found its way to the margins of her books. She titled one poem Creaks in the Silence and sent it to Amelia with a note, because sometimes the things we hear when no one's talking are the most important. By September, the journal was thick with stories. Amelia's voice had matured. She no longer asked if she'd forget. Instead, she wondered what she'd remember most. She wrote, I think what I'll remember isn't what we said, but how it felt. Sitting beside you felt like sitting beside time itself, not scary, just infinite. Margaret replied, and you made it beautiful. Even the sad parts. In mid-September, Margaret fell ill. It wasn't sudden. Just a slow fading. Her hands tired faster. Her breath came shorter. But she still came to the park, still sat on the bench, still traced the grooves of the swing's rope with reverence. One morning, she didn't come. The next day either. By the third day, a note appeared, pinned beneath a small stone on the bench. Margaret is resting now. Thank you for sharing this place with her. Below it, a copy of Emilia's first published story was tucked into the jar of wildflowers. But stories don't end. Not really. A week later, a young mother brought her daughter to the park. The girl sat on the swing, curious, gentle. The mother watched with soft eyes, then sat on the bench, brushing her hand over the wood as if it might speak. And maybe, just maybe, it did. Because a breeze passed through the trees. The swing creaked. The maple shimmered. And a sense of something, someone, lingered. Not as a ghost. Not as grief. But as presence. As story. As love. Waiting, once again, to begin anew. The swing in the old park had aged a little more, its wooden slats revealing grain beneath paint worn thin by wind and time. Yet instead of sorrow, it exuded a quiet beauty, like an old storyteller sitting in the twilight, ready to listen to the hearts that spoke in silence. This autumn, Emilia returned from university with her degree in hand. Not to show off, but to share. She walked along the familiar path, beneath trees that had aged another ring, carrying a small wooden box. Inside were fragments of memory, letters, sketches, voice recordings, and a manuscript of her new book, When the Elderly Smile. She placed the box on the stone bench near the swing, where Margaret once used to sit. In her heart, she whispered, "I'm back, Grandma." That afternoon, the park was livelier than usual. It was the 5th annual Memory Keepers Festival, an event organized by the group Seeds of Remembering. Elderly folks, children, teenagers, parents, everyone gathered in the small garden decorated with ribbons in the colors of memory, lavender, gold, and soft blue. A display area had been set up, where portraits of people who were once part of the story hung between trees, encased in glass. At the center was a photo of Margaret, smiling, her silver hair dancing in the wind. Beneath it was inscribed, "The first who believed that a story could save a life." Julian stood beside Emilia, holding a microphone. Though older now, his eyes still sparkled when he spoke of Margaret. "We are here not just to remember. We are here to continue. To retell, to rewrite, and to share. Today, the Memory Keepers will pass on their stories, to the young, to those who never knew Margaret or Anna or any of us. Because memories aren't for keeping. They're for giving." Soft applause followed, like a breeze ruffling someone's hair from long ago. Emilia stepped into the center of the circle and began to speak. "I used to think sadness was something to hide. That grief was weakness. But then a grandmother sat beside me, said nothing, only held my hand, and I understood, sadness is another form of love. It doesn't need curing. It only needs to be heard." She looked toward a group of students sitting near the swing, writing down stories from their grandparents. One young girl raised her hand. "Miss, what if one day we forget everything? Will these stories disappear?" Emilia smiled. "No, sweetie. What has been told, written, and felt doesn't vanish. It becomes part of someone, in a new form. Like the scent of your grandma's tea. Or a tune she used to hum. Memories are seeds that don't need light to sprout. They live on emotion." That evening, everyone lit candles around the garden. The tiny flames flickered like falling stars, passed hand to hand. Emilia walked to the swing and placed a small book upon it, a collection of poems Margaret had written in her youth, discovered in an old cedar trunk. She read aloud. "When you go, the wind shall guide. When you cry, the leaves will lull. When you miss, I am still here. In winds, in dreams, in unnamed heartbeats." From afar, soft piano music played. A group of children began a game called Rapid Recall, each child telling a story in under a minute, the truer the better. A girl shared how her grandma once burned a cake, and they ate it like the best dessert ever. A boy recalled how his grandfather taught chess by always losing. Emilia sat quietly, listening, her eyes glistening but not sad. She knew bridges had truly formed, stretching across time, space, and even the unspoken. The next day, Emilia returned alone to the park. She sat on the stone bench and opened the wooden box. Inside was one last unopened letter, written in Margaret's familiar hand. Emilia, if you are reading this, it means you've planted something precious. Not every seed will bloom, but if even one has, you've done something far greater than any award. Do you remember our first meeting? A sad little girl on a swing, and an old woman with no one left to tell stories to. Who would have thought two solitudes could grow into a garden of color? Don't stop, even when you're tired. Because you carry within you the gift of listening, a rare kind of magic. I love you. As a grandmother. As a friend. As a piece of memory that will never fade. Margaret. Emilia closed the letter and held it to her chest. A sparrow sang from a nearby branch. She whispered, I'll keep telling the stories. I promise. 10 years later, the park now featured a small memorial house called the Memory Keepers Hall. Every year, hundreds of students came to participate in storytelling exchanges, writing, narrating, drawing, and most importantly, listening. Emilia, now a university professor, still returned each autumn, bringing her class to gather around the old swing. She never lectured. Only asked one question. Who was the first person who told you a story that made you want to hear more? That question sparked countless journeys, where memories ceased to be private and instead became a shared space for meeting, understanding, and healing. As the sunset bathed the garden in amber light, Emilia added a line to her journal. A little girl. A swing. An old woman. And a world stitched back together by the finest threads, friendship, memory, and listening. The story doesn't end. It simply becomes someone else's tale, told on a quiet rainy afternoon beneath the shade of an old swing. And you, who have read this far, might be the next one to pass it on.